Today we are talking about the changes made to Fenrir in the most recent patch in Darkness Falls. These changes are very interesting for multiple reasons, and we'll get into that. But let's first go over the changes and why they led to him actually being picked up in the SPL. Fenrir has always been in a strange spot. As an assassin, his jungle was often on the fringes of being useful, and he instead found himself as an aggressive support. He is seeing a shift today, reducing his early game control and base damage while receiving an increase to his jungle clear and giving him more reasons to build power. Unchained was a high base, low cooldown ability that enabled the support Fenrir play. These aspects are both being reduced. On the opposite side, Brutalize will now always cleave, but at a slightly reduced strength. Runes will now cause Brutalize to scale more with physical power. Players will now have a more clear use case between empowering Unchained for control and Brutalize for more damage, while having access to reliable and strong jungle clear without needing to use runes. The resulting changes are Unchained. Decreased base damage from 95 to 335 to 75 to 315, so 20 base of all ranks, which especially hits the earlier ranks of course. Decreased amount of cooldown decrease on successful hit from 50% to 30%, half to 1/3. So this is, I guess, a secondary effect unless you were playing Fenrir support, in which case it was very relevant because Fenrir support was basically good as long as you hit Unchained and bad if you don't hit Unchained, because that was all his CC, and if he doesn't get the reduction, then it's over for you. Well, not all his CC, obviously you still have the ultimate, but all his CC that he can frequently use in lane to set up. And with Brutalize, we now have this ability will now always cleave. Reduced cleave damage from 75% of total to 50% of total. At max runes, this ability will deal an additional 15% of your physical power per hit. So why is this change so impactful? Mostly because of the Brutalize buffs here, of course. So changes rather, but I would call them buffs overall. Because what you can do with Brutalize now is use it to reliably clear camps or waves at any point. Previously, if you were to clear the jungle, you would take a lot longer than other junglers because you would constantly have to land 5 basics to get your runes up. And with a solo lane, for example, or with laning in general, you would also run into the issue that if you used your cleave, your AoE on the 3, then the enemy would know that your stun would be down afterwards, making you much less of a threat in that regard, and for example not allowing you to disrupt enemies doing what they're doing. Let's first talk a little bit about the solo side here. So Fenrir was picked up in competitive to counter King Arthur. It didn't go perfectly all the way, but at least in lane the situation was surprisingly good for Fenrir. Now this was a little bit matchup specific, and we can talk about that and later also talk about it in general. With King Arthur there are a few interesting things to note. First of all, King Arthur can interrupt Fenrir's Brutalize. That's always something that's important for Fenrir in regards to where he is useful and where he isn't. Because on one hand King Arthur has his ultimate, which will interrupt Fenrir's Brutalize because it's just hard CC. And on the other hand, King Arthur's 1 can also cripple while in combo stance. Now, the 1 is a bit situational, I suppose, because I'm not quite sure if that works at any point of the animation with how Fenrir's Brutalize works, but it can definitely be used to counter it out. The interesting thing is that normally King Arthur's combo starts with a knock-up as a setup for himself, and that doesn't really work because Brutalize makes you knock-up immune. So King Arthur has to really make the decision to sacrifice either a major part of his clear or even his ultimate in order to stop Fenrir from brutalizing, and that may be on himself or on the wave. Furthermore, as Ponpon pointed out, when King Arthur is in his 3 in the combo stance spinning, he cannot interrupt it. That means if Fenrir starts brutalizing him while he does that, he actually has no way of stopping Fenrir from doing the Brutalize, which is a little bit more scary than the spin, I would say, overall. And that of course excludes the fact that Fenrir can now also reliably use his runes for the 1 and can therefore decide to disrupt King Arthur's clear in that way by stopping him from doing the spin in the first place. But that's not the only matchup that's more favorable for Fenrir in solo now. He's generally going to be more able to deal with enemies that have some sort of channeled ability, as he will now be able to reliably use the stun on them without sacrificing his own wave clear, so he can basically go into the stun on the enemy and then switch over to the minions for the Brutalize, or even use the Brutalize on a guard and hit all the minions around him with it as well. Now, I'm not a solo main by any stretch of imagination, but I remember my experiences with Fenrir in solo in the past being rather painful, and the first one that I had with this very patch was a lot better. It was still not perfect for sure, and I think Fenrir is still one of those solo picks that you really need to figure out properly to play him well, but it definitely doesn't feel as rough anymore as beforehand, even if you mess up a little bit and you're not playing it perfectly. And this is even more true for the jungle, in my opinion. In jungle, you can make full use of the fact that the Brutalize has higher power scaling at 5 stacks because you're going to build a lot more power. Now, of course, you won't always be able to use the 3 that way because often enough you want to use your 1 for the stun. That's your primarily gank and engage tool. But sometimes teamfights go on for a while and you are able to restack those runes, in which case, if you can get the 3 on an enemy, you will deal up to 60% extra scaling, and that should not be underestimated. After all, it means we're talking about a 260% scaling ability, so we can actually go into full power builds with Transcendence and similar things as well if we want to. I will say this, I've despised playing Fenrir jungle for years. He was actually one of the most disliked assassins I had for jungle specifically, along with Loki. And last time I played him now, after this patch, was the first time I actually really enjoyed Fenrir jungle. And that is despite, again, messing up a lot because I'm really not used to playing Fenrir at all. And speaking of not being used to things, there's another thing we need to address here, and that is the leveling order. Previously, you would often maximize the 1 first, especially in situations where there were a lot of enemies that could disrupt or interrupt the 3 in a way, so you wouldn't get the full damage off. That will probably change with this patch. Now, with Unchained doing 75 damage, even just 2 hits of Brutalize on the first rank will deal more damage, and on the last rank you have 315 damage, whereas 2 hits of Brutalize will end up dealing 330 damage. And also have more scaling on top of that. So even if you're facing enemies that can interrupt your 3, there is a good chance you will still get more damage out of the 3 than you will get out of the 1 in many situations, given that most interrupts are happening after the second hit of Brutalize, unless the enemy is reacting very, very quickly and is expecting you. Even more importantly, with the changes to the 3 will also be your primary clearing tool, and as such you want to level that as much as possible, because you have to keep in mind that while he always has the cleave now, the cleaved targets around the main target only get 50% of the damage. So that means that leveling this will usually help you clear the small minions around a camp, at least decently get them down to 1 hit or something, whereas if you level the 1, that won't necessarily be the case. And you will use your 1 for jungling more in that way. In the past, you could also often skip over the 2 in earlier levels, and that is definitely still possible, but there's a bit less of a reason to do so now, as the power that you get can help you deal more damage with your 3 as well, with the additional 60% scaling on top of the 200% that you already get from the ability. So you can really make your 3 hit very, very hard with a higher level 2. The problem here is that most of the time, even with these changes, you will probably still want to use your 1, the stun, to hit a target primarily, at least when you're ganking, and you will use your runes for that over the additional scaling on the 3. So again, this is something that comes a bit down to the situation. You have to decide when this makes sense, but there are situations where you might actually want to opt out of maxing the 1 until you've maxed the 3 and the 2. This mostly comes into question when you can hit a lot of basics on the enemy or you use your full combo, because at that point the additional scaling that you can get can almost outweigh the extra base damage from the 1, and then can completely outweigh it if you add in enough basics with the higher scaling through the power. A bit more complex than necessary maybe, but something to be aware of for situations where the enemies don't have many escapes, or you can follow them through the escapes and land a few basics. The fact that this is even possible represents a major shift in how Fenrir is generally played, because in the past we would do the opposite. We'd max the 1 first and there was the option to consider maxing the 2 before the 3 because you wouldn't even use the 3 in that way. And you would maybe use the 2 for attack cancels more and things like that. And now we see it being turned around in the sense that Brutalize can be your main damaging tool if you are able to use it effectively, even if you're not able to use all 4 hits of it. What will remain a problem for Fenrir, of course, is the fact that he is hard countered by cripples to a massive degree, and that is something that he will always struggle with, and is especially hard for him in jungle when he's going for a more damage focused build, because then you can disrupt him out of that and he's pretty much done for. So gods like Artio will always counter him, and that will always give Fenrir a bit of a harder time in the meta. But as long as you're not facing that situation, Fenrir feels amazing right now, and if you haven't given him a try in a while, then I would highly recommend testing him out. If you're wondering if much has changed build-wise, no, not really. You can still use all the items that you used before, only that you're now able to use higher damage items, higher power items especially as well, and really get a load of damage out of Brutalize. I hope this was interesting and insightful and maybe put Fenrir on your radar a little bit. If you're new to the channel, feel free to sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one soon. DukeSloth, out.